You can always tell when someone isn't used to this kind of silver, Margaret sneered, her eyes locked on Audrey's hands. The insult hung in the dining room of the Lake Forest mansion, thick and suffocating. Liam's mother didn't even bother to lower her voice as she leaned over her perfectly plated duck confit and muttered the words "gold digger" to her husband. Audrey just offered a polite, closed-mouthed smile, taking a slow sip of her cabinet. She didn't mind the insult. Let them think she was a desperate girl after their family fortune. After all, Margaret and Richard Preston had absolutely no idea that the very mahogany table they sat at, the crystal they drank from, and the legacy business that paid for it all, secretly belonged to the woman they were actively trying to humiliate. Audrey Linwood was an anomaly in the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley tech founders, mostly because she left it all behind the moment she hit the jackpot. At 28, she had developed a proprietary back-end logistics algorithm that caught the eye of Salesforce. The acquisition was quiet, handled behind closed doors, and deposited a cool $402 million into her personal accounts after taxes. Instead of buying a mega mansion in Calabasas or flaunting designer labels on Instagram, Audrey moved to a modest, two-bedroom apartment in the Wicker Park neighborhood of Chicago. She drove a dented 2015 Subaru Outback, bought her clothes from vintage stores and the occasional Zara sale, and introduced herself to new acquaintances as a freelance data consultant. She had learned the hard way that immense wealth changed people. In her past, friends had suddenly needed loans that were never repaid, and a former fiancé had confessed he only proposed because he wanted seed money for his failing craft brewery. Audrey wanted to be loved for the girl who ate cold pizza and loved classic literature, not for her stock portfolio. She met Liam Preston on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at a local intelligentsia coffee shop. He had accidentally bumped into her table, spilling half of his flat white onto her open laptop. Horrified, he had spent the next 20 minutes frantically offering to buy her a new computer, unaware that the sticker-covered machine was backed up to a private enterprise-grade cloud server. "I'm so sorry," Liam had stammered, his blue eyes wide with genuine panic. "I'm Liam. Please let me give you my card. I'll replace it today." Audrey had laughed, wiping the coffee off the keyboard with a napkin. "It's a rugged model. It survives worse. I'm Audrey. And you can make it up to me by buying me a fresh black coffee." That coffee turned into a 4-hour conversation. Liam was charismatic, grounded, and passionately driven. He told her about his family's company, Preston Development, a legacy commercial real estate firm that had built half of the boutique hotels in the Gold Coast district. To Mema Baba, Liam was captivated by Audrey's sharp wit, her unpretentious nature, and her quiet intelligence. He loved that she wasn't like the wealthy, superficial debutantes his mother was always trying to set him up with at the country club. He loved her tiny apartment, her messy bun, and the way she made him feel like he was enough. But Liam also had a blind spot. He assumed Audrey was constantly struggling financially. Because she budgeted her freelance income carefully to maintain her cover, Liam often insisted on paying for their dinners at nice restaurants or buying her small gifts to help her out. Audrey accepted these gestures gracefully, knowing it brought him joy to provide for her. "You don't have to worry about the check, Audrey," Liam told her one evening at an upscale Italian place in River North, gently pulling the leather billfolder from her hands. "I know freelance work can be unpredictable. The firm just closed a mid-sized deal. Let me spoil you." "Thank you, Liam," she said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. She didn't have the heart to tell him that her wealth manager at Morgan Stanley, a shrewd man named David Rothcroft, had just informed her that her conservative index funds had yielded a passive $1 with Liam. She was blissfully happy in her bubble with Liam. But the bubble was about to burst, not because of Audrey's secret, but because the Preston family empire was built on a foundation of sand. The first crack in the facade appeared during a weekend getaway to a cabin in Wisconsin. Liam spent the entire Saturday pacing the wooden deck, aggressively whispering into his phone. When he finally came back inside, he looked like he had aged 5 years. "Hey," Audrey said gently, handing him a mug of tea. "You've been tense all month, but today you look genuinely sick." Liam slumped onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. "It's my dad. It's Preston Development. We're going under, Audrey." Audrey sat beside him, keeping her expression perfectly neutral. "What do you mean? I thought the Riverfront Heights project was going to be the firm's crown jewel." "That's the problem," Liam admitted, his voice cracking. "My father over-leveraged the company to fund it. He took out a massive mezzanine loan with predatory interest rates from a private equity firm in New York. There were supply chain issues, contractor delays. The project is stalled. The loan matured last week. If my dad doesn't come up with $12 million by the end of the month, they're foreclosing on everything." "Sylvester, my dad is a proud man. He's been pretending everything is fine to the board, to the country club, to my mum. But he called me crying today. I don't know what to do. I have maybe 50 grand in my personal savings. It's like trying to stop a hemorrhage with a band-aid." Audrey pulled him into her arms, letting him cry against her shoulder. The next morning, while Liam was in the shower, Audrey opened her laptop. She didn't look at freelance graphic design jobs. She logged into her encrypted email and sent a high-priority message to her legal team at Kirkland & Ellis and copied David Rothcroft. Subject: urgent. Acquisition and bridge loan inquiry. Want to buy the debt? Within 48 hours, Audrey was sitting in a soundproof, glass-walled conference room on the 30th floor of a downtown high-rise. Thomas Abernathy, the overhead shark of a corporate lawyer, slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany table. They are going to strip his company for parts. Can we buy the debt from Vanguard? Audrey asked, her voice entirely devoid of the warmth Liam knew. Here, she was the brilliant, ruthless strategist who had cornered the data market. We can, Thomas nodded. Vanguard just wants their money back. They'll sell the paper to us for exactly what's owed, plus a penalty fee. Roughly 12.4 million. But Audrey, as your fiduciary, I have to advise against this. Preston Development is a sinking ship. The ROI on this is terrible. I don't care about the ROI, Audrey stated flatly. I want to set up an anonymous LLC. Let's call it Apex Sentinel Holdings. Apex will buy the debt from Vanguard, effectively becoming Preston Development's sole creditor. Then, Apex will immediately restructure the loan, drop the interest rate to a manageable 2%, and inject an additional $3 million in operational liquidity to finish the riverfront project. But the terms must be ironclad. Apex gets complete audit rights, and Richard Preston cannot make a single executive financial decision without Apex's blind proxy approval. Thomas raised an eyebrow. A hostile rescue. An educational one, Audrey corrected. To Richard Preston, Apex is just a faceless, benevolent private equity group out of Delaware. Understood. 2 weeks later, Liam burst into Audrey's Wicker Park apartment, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. We're saved, he shouted, laughing hysterically. Audrey, it's a miracle. My dad found an angel investment firm at the 11th hour, Apex something or other. They bought out the bad debt, restructured our loans, and gave us the capital to finish Riverfront. My dad is a genius. He somehow talked these corporate titans into believing in his vision. Audrey smiled, adjusting her oversized thrift store sweater. Liam, that's incredible news. I'm so happy for you and your family. We're celebrating, Liam declared. My mom is throwing a massive dinner party next month at the estate to celebrate the company's strategic pivot. And I told them I'm bringing you. Audrey's smile didn't waver, but a cold knot formed in her stomach. I can't wait. The Preston family estate in Lake Forest was an intimidating display of Gilded Age architecture. A sweeping gravel driveway led up to a massive Tudor-style mansion flanked by impeccably manicured topiary gardens. As Liam pulled his leased BMW past the iron gates, Audrey looked out the window, mentally calculating the property tax on such a monstrous place. Thanks to her recent review of their financials, she knew Richard was 3 months behind on those exact taxes, a problem her recent $3 million cash injection had quietly solved just days prior. Audrey had made a conscious decision about her outfit. She could have easily walked into the dressing room of a Neiman Marcus and purchased a common dollar's Chanel dress to impress Liam's mother. But she refused to play that game. If Margaret and Richard Preston were going to accept her, they had to accept the version of Audrey that Liam had fallen in love with. So, she wore a simple, elegant navy dress from Zara, paired with modest black flats and minimal makeup. The moment the grand mahogany door swung open, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret Preston stood in the foyer, dripping in pearls and a silk Carolina Herrera gown. She had the kind of taut, surgically enhanced face that made smiling look like a tremendous physical effort. Beside her stood Richard, a tall, imposing man smelling of expensive scotch and unearned arrogance. "Mom, Dad, this is Audrey," Liam said, his voice brimming with pride. Margaret's eyes immediately did a slow, sweeping scan of Audrey's outfit. The appraisal lasted less than 2 seconds, but the verdict was loud and clear. "Dismissal, Audrey." "How, Audrey?" "Quaint," Margaret said, extending a limp, manicured hand. "Liam has told us so little about you. I assumed you were one of the girls from the yacht club he used to date." Obviously, I was mistaken. It's a pleasure to meet you both, Audrey replied politely, ignoring the blatant slight. Liam speaks very highly of his family. Richard gave a gruff nod. Let's move to the dining room. I have a 1990 Bordeaux breeding that cost more than my first car. The dining room was an opulent, suffocating space with velvet drapes and a massive chandelier. As the uniformed house staff began serving courses of beluga caviar and duck confit, the interrogation commenced. It wasn't polite dinner conversation, it was a deposition disguised as small talk. Dad, Liam warned, his jaw tightening. I specialize in data architecture and back-end logistics consulting, Audrey answered calmly. It's project-based. Margaret let out a dry, breathy laugh. Project-based, that's the modern term for unemployed, isn't it? Tell me, dear, where did you summer growing up? Nantucket? Martha's Vineyard? Mostly in the public library in Cincinnati, Audrey said with a polite smile. My parents were public school teachers. Margaret dropped her silver escargot tongs onto her china plate with a loud clink. She looked at her husband with an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. Public school, Margaret repeated, tasting the words as if they were spoiled milk. I see. Margaret made pointed remarks about the rising cost of country club dues, the importance of breeding in social circles, and how some people view marriage as a financial stepping stone rather than a union of equals. Liam pushed back constantly, his face flushed with anger, defending Audrey at every turn. But Audrey simply sat there, eating her duck, refusing to be rattled. The climax of the evening occurred, just as dessert was being cleared. Liam excused himself to take a call from the site manager at Riverfront Heights. The moment his footsteps faded down the hall, Margaret set her napkin down and fixed Audrey with a venomous glare. Let's drop the act, shall we? Margaret whispered, leaning across the table. You can always tell when someone isn't used to this kind of silver. You're out of your depth, Audrey. I'm not sure I follow, Mrs. Preston, Audrey said, maintaining her placid expression. Oh, please. Girl from a blue-collar background, living in a shoebox, suddenly sinks her claws into the hair of the Preston fortune. Margaret sneered, the words gold digger practically vibrating in the air between them. My husband just secured a massive influx of capital from a major New York firm. Our company is worth tens of millions. Liam's inheritance is secure, and you are not going to get a single red cent of it. Richard leaned back in his chair, lighting a cigar. What my wife is trying to say, Audrey, is that we know a parasite when we see one. You think you've hit the jackpot with my boy. Audrey looked at Richard, taking in the smug, arrogant curl of his lips. This was the man who just 3 weeks ago had wept on the phone to his son because he was terrified of going to federal prison for financial negligence. This was the man who was currently breathing life into a business using her money. Margaret stood up, smoothing her silk gown. Follow me to the study, Audrey. We are going to have a little business transaction. Intrigued, Audrey stood and followed the matriarch down a long, portrait-lined hallway. The study was heavily paneled in oak, smelling of leather and old paper. Margaret walked directly to a heavy mahogany desk, opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. She uncapped a Mont Blanc pen and quickly scrawled across a check. She ripped it from the ledger and slapped it down on the desk, sliding it toward Audrey. $50,000, Margaret said coldly. Tax-free. More money than you've likely seen in your entire life. You will take this check, you will call an Uber, and you will break up with my son over a text message tonight. You will never speak to him again. Audrey looked down at the check. Pay to the order of Audrey Linwood. 50,000 even. Audrey had $50,000 sitting in a secondary checking account just for minor, unforeseen living expenses. But the sheer audacity of the gesture, the cruel, calculating nature of this woman, ignited a quiet, icy fury deep inside Audrey's chest. $50,000, Audrey murmured, her voice soft. Thousands of Audrey slowly reached out. Her fingers brushed the edge of the check. She picked it up, inspecting the signature. Margaret Preston. Then, looking directly into Margaret's cold, condescending eyes, Audrey deliberately placed her thumbs on the top edge of the paper. With a sharp, crisp sound, she tore the check in half. Then, in quarters. She let the pieces flutter to the Persian rug at Margaret's feet. "I think there's a misunderstanding, Mrs. Preston," Audrey said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all of its former deference. "I'm not here for your family's money." Margaret's face turned a mottled, furious red. "You insolent little—" "Mom? Audrey?" Liam appeared in the doorway, his face pale, holding his cell phone. He looked from the torn pieces of paper on the floor to his mother's enraged face, and finally to Audrey. "What is going on in here?" Liam demanded, his voice thick with tension. "Your mother was just showing me her stationery," Audrey said smoothly, stepping away from the desk. "But I think it's time for me to go, Liam. Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Preston." It was incredibly enlightening. As Audrey walked out of the study, she made a decision. She had tried to be kind. She had tried to save Liam's family without humiliating them. But Richard and Margaret Preston had just declared war on her, armed with nothing but unearned arrogance and a complete lack of awareness. They thought they were the kings of the castle. It was time. Audrey showed them exactly who held the deed. The drive back to Wicker Park that night was suffocatingly quiet. The neon glow of the Chicago skyline reflected off the windshield of Liam's BMW, casting long, shifting shadows across his tense jaw. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "Audrey, I am so sorry," Liam finally said, his voice raw as he pulled up to her apartment building. "I saw the check on the floor. I know exactly what my mother did. I've never been more humiliated in my entire life." Audrey unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to him, her expression calm but unreadable. "I'm resigning from Preston Development tomorrow. I can't work for a man who sits back while his wife tries to buy off the woman I love. I'll find a job at a different architectural firm. We don't need their money, and we sure as hell don't need their approval." Audrey felt a pang of genuine affection for him. He was willing to throw away his family legacy for her, entirely unaware that there was no legacy left to salvage. But she couldn't let him quit. If Liam resigned, he would lose his severance package when the company was inevitably restructured. More importantly, she needed him inside the building for the next phase of her plan. "Liam, don't," Audrey said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Your father's firm just got a second chance with that new capital. You've worked on the Riverfront Heights project for 2 years. You deserve to see it finished. Don't let your mother's bitterness ruin your career. Give it a few weeks. Let the dust settle." Reluctantly, Liam agreed, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You're too good for us, Audrey. I don't deserve you." You have no idea, Audrey thought, resting her chin on his shoulder. The next morning, at precisely 8:00 a.m., Audrey sat at her small kitchen table. She bypassed her usual vintage mug and poured her black coffee into a heavy Yeti tumbler. She opened her encrypted laptop and initiated a secure video call with Thomas Abernathy at Kirkland & Ellis. "Good morning, Audrey," Thomas said, appearing on the screen against the backdrop of his sleek LaSalle Street office. "I assume by the early hour this isn't a social call." "Trigger the blind proxy clause, Thomas," Audrey said, her voice entirely stripped of its usual warmth. "I want a full, invasive forensic audit of Preston Development. Bring in the bloodhounds, hire Deloitte, and tell them to leave no stone unturned. Want every receipt, every wire transfer, and every expense report from the last 6 months." Thomas raised a silver eyebrow. "Did Richard Preston step out of line?" "He took my $3 million bridge loan to finish the riverfront project," Audrey stated, her eyes narrowing. "But I have a feeling the contractors haven't seen a dime of it yet. Find out where my money is going." "48 hours later, the illusion of the Preston family's salvation shattered. Richard Preston was sitting in his corner office, nursing a glass of Macallan Actine, when his secretary nervously buzzed his intercom. "Mr. Preston, there are 4 people here from Deloitte. They say they have a mandate from Apex Sentinel Holdings to size your hard drives and physical ledgers." Richard spilled his scotch down the front of his custom Brooks Brothers shirt. "What? That's impossible." "Call security." But it wasn't impossible. When Richard frantically dialed the emergency contact number for Apex Sentinel, he was routed to Thomas Abernathy's icy voicemail. By the end of the week, the auditors had completed their preliminary report, and the findings were catastrophic. Audrey sat in Thomas's office, reading through the bound Deloitte dossier. She felt a cold, hard anger settle in her stomach. Richard Preston hadn't used the $3 million to pay the stalled contractors at Riverfront Heights. Instead, he had funneled $400 into a shadow account to pay off a massive gambling debt he had incurred in Las Vegas. He had authorized a $150,000 executive bonus to himself, which Margaret had immediately used to purchase a summer allocation at a private villa in Lake Como. He had even used the bridge loan to catch up on his delinquent property taxes for the Lake Forest estate. "He's embezzling his own bailout money," Thomas said, leaning back in his leather chair. "It's textbook fraud. Apex Sentinel has every legal right to call in the debt immediately, seize the company assets, and file criminal charges." Audrey closed the dossier. The image of Margaret Preston sneering at her Zara dress flashed in her mind. "You can always tell when someone isn't used to this kind of silver." "We aren't going to call the police, Thomas," Audrey said, a dangerous razor-thin smile touching her lips. "That's too easy. I want to look him in the eye when I take his company. Draft a mandatory summons. Apex Sentinel is calling a board meeting this Friday at your offices. Tell Richard his attendance is non-negotiable, or we seize the collateral by Monday." How Richard was sweating under the microscopic gaze of Deloitte's forensic accountants. Margaret Preston was fighting a different kind of war. Furious that Audrey hadn't disappeared after the torn check incident, Margaret decided to take matters into her own hands. She contacted a private investigator named Arthur Pendleton, an ex-Chicago PD detective who ran a boutique firm catering to the Gold Coast elite. His specialty was digging up dirt on prospective sons and daughters-in-law. "I want everything on her, Arthur," Margaret had instructed over a covert lunch at the signature room. "Credit card debt, eviction notices, criminal records. I know she's a fraud. She claims to be some sort of tech consultant, but she drives a beaten-up Subaru and lives in Wicker Park. Find the skeleton in her closet." 2 days before the mandated Apex board meeting, Arthur slid a thin manila envelope across a table at a quiet cafe. Margaret snatched it up eagerly. "It's a dry well, Mrs. Progis." "Preston," Arthur said, stirring his coffee. "Audrey Linwood is a ghost. She pays her rent on time. Her car is paid off. She has no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. She attended a state university in Ohio on a full academic scholarship." Margaret scowled, flipping through the meager pages. "What about her income?" "She must have debt." "Who is paying her bills?" "Her primary checking account is at Chase, and it never drops below $50,000, but there are no direct deposits from any recognizable employers. When I tried to dig into her tax records, I hit a massive digital firewall. She's protected by some very heavy ironclad non-disclosure agreements and a series of blind trusts anchored out of Delaware." Margaret's eyes widened, but her inherent arrogance blinded her to the truth. "Delaware trusts, NDAs? Oh, I see exactly what's going on. She's a high-end escort, or she's surviving on hush money from some married executive. I knew she was garbage." She paid Arthur and left the cafe, feeling triumphant. Liam was working 80-hour weeks, frantically trying to placate angry foremen at the riverfront site who still hadn't been paid. "Irregularities. My dad won't tell me what he did, but he's terrified. He has to go to a disciplinary meeting tomorrow at Kirkland and Ellis downtown. He says the board might remove him as CEO." Audrey poured him a glass of water, keeping her face completely impassive. "That sounds incredibly stressful, Liam. Are you going to the meeting with him?" "No, it's strictly executive," Liam sighed. "Just my dad, his lawyer, and the Apex representatives. My mom is coming downtown with him, though. She's completely oblivious. She booked a personal shopper at Saks Fifth Avenue for the morning and wants to meet him for lunch at Gibson's afterward to celebrate. She thinks he's just going in to negotiate better loan terms." Audrey took a slow sip of her water. "Perfect. Liam, Audrey said softly. I'd love that. Friday morning arrived with the crisp, biting Chicago wind. Audrey did not reach for her vintage sweaters or her comfortable flats. Today, she was not the sweet freelance consultant from Wicker Park. Today, she was the apex predator. She walked to the back of her closet and unzipped a garment bag she hadn't touched since the day she finalized the Salesforce acquisition. Inside was a bespoke, charcoal gray Tom Ford power suit, tailored to absolute perfection. She paired it with a crisp, white silk blouse and black Christian Louboutin pumps that clicked with lethal authority against a hardwood floor. Finally, she retrieved a small velvet box from her safe. She fastened the platinum Rolex Daytona around her wrist, a quiet, undeniable symbol of immense, unbothered wealth. She looked in the mirror. The girl who ate cold pizza and loved classic literature was gone. Audrey picked up her phone and dialed Thomas Abernathy. Thomas, it's time. Make sure Richard Preston is seated in the main conference room before I arrive. Oh, and Thomas. Audrey paused, a cold smirk playing on her lips. If Margaret Preston is waiting in the lobby, have security escort her up to the viewing gallery. I want her to have a front row seat. The offices of Kirtland and Ellis commanded the top floors of a sleek, glass and steel skyscraper overlooking the Chicago River. The main conference room, a cavernous space of polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows, felt more like an execution chamber than a meeting space. Richard Preston sat at the long table, his usually ruddy face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He continuously adjusted the knot of his silk tie, shooting anxious glances at his corporate attorney, a balding man who looked equally terrified. They had spent the last 48 hours trying to build a defense against the Deloitte audit, but there was no defending a paper trail that read like a masterclass in corporate embezzlement. In a soundproof, glass-walled viewing gallery adjacent to the boardroom, Margaret Preston sat on a plush leather sofa, sipping sparkling water with a twist of lime. Thomas Abernathy had personally instructed the receptionist to escort her up, claiming it was standard protocol for spouses of key stakeholders to observe restructuring meetings. Margaret was irritated by the delay but entirely confident. She assumed her brilliant husband was about to renegotiate their loan terms and put this faceless apex sentinel firm in their place. Thomas Abernathy walked in first, his face a mask of practiced lethal neutrality. He carried a single thick black binder. He didn't sit down. Instead, he stood beside the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, the seat of absolute authority. Mr. Preston, Thomas said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Thank you for coming. The majority shareholder and CEO of Apex Sentinel Holdings will be leading this meeting. Richard forced a tight, arrogant smile. Let's get this over with, Abernathy. I have a lunch reservation at Gibson's, and I don't appreciate being summoned like a junior analyst. Where is your boss? Footsteps clicked sharply against the hardwood floor of the corridor. Measured, unhurried. Audrey Linwood stepped into the room. She looked nothing like the girl who had sat in Richard's dining room 3 weeks prior, the bespoke Tom Ford suit draped flawlessly over her frame, radiating an aura of untouchable wealth and power. The platinum Rolex Daytona caught the ambient light, flashing a quiet warning. Her expression was devoid of empathy, warmth, or the polite deference she had offered them in Lake Forest. Richard's jaw slackened. He blinked, hard, as if trying to clear a hallucination. In the viewing gallery, Margaret leaned forward, her perfectly manicured hand freezing halfway to her mouth, the glass of sparkling water trembling. What is this? Richard demanded, his voice cracking as he looked from Audrey to Thomas. What kind of sick joke is this, Abernathy? Why is my son's? Why is she here? I'm here to speak with the head of Apex Sentinel. I am the sole proprietor of Apex Sentinel Holdings. I am the entity that bought your $12 million toxic debt from Vanguard. I am the one who injected $3 million into your failing company so your son wouldn't have to watch his legacy burn. And, as of the Deloitte audit completed at 8,000 a.m. this morning, I am the woman who holds your entire life in the palm of her hand. Silence crashed down over the room. It was absolute and suffocating. Richard looked at his lawyer, desperate for a denial, but the attorney only stared at his legal pad, refusing to make eye contact. That's impossible, Richard stammered, his arrogance instantly evaporating into raw panic. You drive a Subaru, you live in a shoebox, you're a freelancer. You're in proprietary software logistics firm to Salesforce for $42 million when I was 28. Audrey corrected smoothly, pulling out the chair and sitting down. I drive a Subaru because I value reliability over desperate status symbols, a lesson you clearly never learned. She gestured to Thomas, who dropped the thick black binder onto the table with a resounding thud. It landed directly in front of Richard. Page 4, Audrey commanded. Trembling, Richard opened the binder. $400,000, Audrey read aloud, not needing to look at the pages. That is the exact amount you wired from the Apex Sentinel bridge loan to a Shadow LLC registered in Nevada, which was then immediately used to clear a gambling debt at the Bellagio. Turn to page 9. Richard swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. Money that your wife then used to secure a summer villa in Lake Como. Audrey leaned back, steepling her fingers. The gold digger she had tried to pay off with $50,000 was currently executing her husband with the precision of a seasoned sniper. Please, Richard whispered, his voice breaking. The blustering patriarch was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified old man. Please, Audrey. I was going to put the money back. The riverfront project is going to pay out massive dividends. I just needed to float the debts. Don't go to the authorities. I'll do anything. I know you will, Audrey said coldly, because you have no other choice. Just then, the boardroom doors opened again. Liam stepped inside, dressed in a sharp navy suit, a warm smile on his face. He had come up early to surprise Audrey for lunch, expecting her to be waiting in the lobby. Liam froze. He looked at his father, who was crying silently into his hands. He looked at Thomas Abernathy, standing like a sentinel. He looked through the glass at his mother, who looked as if she were about to faint. And finally he looked at Audrey, sitting in the CEO's chair, radiating an authority he had never seen before. Audrey? Liam asked, his voice echoing in the tense silence. Dad? What is going on? The silence in the Kirtland and Ellis boardroom was so absolute that the faint, rhythmic ticking of Audrey's platinum Rolex sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood. Liam stood frozen just inside the heavy oak doors, his eyes darting frantically between the weeping figure of his father, the stoic composure of Thomas Abernathy, and finally, the imposing, unrecognizable presence of the woman he loved. Audrey, Liam asked again, his voice barely a whisper, fracturing the tension. Dad? What is going on? Why is she sitting there? Audrey's icy exterior, meticulously crafted for this exact execution, softened for just a fraction of a second execution, softened for just a fraction of a second. This was the collateral damage she had desperately wanted to avoid. She had wanted to protect Liam from the devastating reality of his family's corruption, but the rot in his father's foundation had simply been too deep to hide. Sit down, Liam, Audrey said. Her voice wasn't the cold, corporate blade she had used on Richard. It was gentle, grounded, and achingly familiar. Liam slowly walked to the nearest leather chair and sank into it, his eyes never leaving her face. Over the next 30 agonizing minutes, Audrey laid out the entire, unvarnished truth. She didn't gloat, and she didn't embellish to make herself look like a savior. She simply presented the empirical facts. She explained the Salesforce acquisition, her real financial status, the silent bridge loan she had orchestrated through Apex Sentinel to save his family from Vanguard Capital, and the subsequent forensic audit that had just concluded at 8 o'clock that morning. Liam listened in stunned, horrifying silence. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He reached across the polished mahogany table and pulled the Delaware audit binder toward him. He didn't need to be a forensic accountant to understand the highlighted ledgers. He traced the lines of ink with a trembling finger, the gambling debts at the Bellagio, the ghost company wire transfers, the gross company wire transfers, the gross misuse of the bailout funds. He looked at his father. Richard couldn't even meet his son's eyes, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with pathetic, silent sobs. You stole from our own contractors, Liam whispered. His voice wasn't loud, but it vibrated with a rage so profound it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. I have been standing on the riverfront heights site in the freezing rain every single day, looking those 4 men in the eye, swearing to them on my life that their checks were coming. And you were using the money to pay off Vegas bookies and fund Mom's Italian vacations. Liam, son, you have to understand the immense pressure I was under, Richard pleaded, finally looking up, his face slick with tears and sweat. Many a minute. Liam turned to Audrey, his expression a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions, profound betrayal, utter awe, and deep, suffocating shame. You paid off Vanguard. You gave us the $3 million. I did, Audrey said, holding his gaze steadily. But I couldn't let him steal my money to fund a criminal enterprise either. Before Liam could process the magnitude of her confession, the boardroom doors burst open a second time. Margaret Preston had managed to bypass the electronic lock on the viewing gallery door, likely by threatening a junior paralegal in the hallway. She stumbled into the boardroom, her composure entirely shattered. The immaculate, terrifying matriarch of Lake Forest was gone. Her designer silk blouse was wrinkled, her perfect blowout was disheveled, and her eyes were wide with a desperate, frantic kind of calculation. She looked at Audrey. The woman she had sneered at, The woman whose Zara dress she had mocked, the woman she had tried to discard with a $50,000 check, was suddenly revealed to be a corporate titan capable of erasing the Preston legacy with a single phone call. "Audrey, darling," Margaret gasped, forcing a grotesque, trembling smile as she rushed toward the head of the table. "This is all a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Richard was foolish, yes, absolutely foolish, but we are family. We can keep this in-house. Liam loves you so much, and you love him. You and we got off on the wrong foot, but I always knew you were a brilliant, exceptional girl." Margaret reached out as if to grasp Audrey's hands. Audrey simply leaned back in her high-backed leather chair, steepling her fingers, her face a mask of absolute disgust. "Save it, Margaret," Audrey said, her voice dropping an octave, echoing with lethal finality. "I remember exactly what you think of me. You can always tell when someone isn't used to this kind of silver. Isn't that what you said? You thought I was a parasite. You hired a private investigator to dig through my trash." Margaret flinched as her own words and actions were weaponized against her, taking a physical step back. "I'm not here to join your twisted, superficial family," Audrey continued, her eyes locking onto Richard. "I'm here to amputate the rot. Richard, these are my terms, and they're entirely non-negotiable." Thomas Abernathy stepped forward, sliding a crisp stack of legal documents across the table. "First," Audrey stated, her tone sharp and precise, "you will resign as CEO of Preston Development effective immediately. Second, you will sign over your remaining 40% equity stake entirely to Liam. Third, you and Margaret will vacate the Lake Forest estate by the end of the month. I am transferring the deed to an Apex Sentinel holding company to liquidate and cover the exact amount of capital you embezzled from my bridge loan." Richard let out a strangled, breathless sound. "The house? Audrey, please, my grandfather built that house. Will be ruined. The country club, the board of directors, our friends, will be absolute laughingstocks in Chicago society. Where are we supposed to go? You should have thought about your social calendar before you committed federal wire fraud and tried to bribe the woman dating your son." Thomas Abernathy interjected smoothly, tapping a silver pen against the documents. "You have exactly 60 seconds before I dial the FBI field office and have you escorted out of this building in handcuffs." Defeated, broken, and violently stripped of his lifelong arrogance, Richard Preston took the pen. With a trembling hand, he signed his empire, his home, and his legacy away. Margaret collapsed into a chair in the corner, sobbing hysterically into her hands, mourning the only thing she had ever truly loved, her status. The fallout between Audrey and Liam was not resolved in a single afternoon. When they left the Kirkland and Ellis building that day, Liam had asked for space. He was devastated by his parents' criminality, but he was equally reeling from the sheer magnitude of Audrey's deception. For 3 weeks he lived out of a suitcase in a downtown hotel, grappling with the reality that the woman he loved had been wearing a mask. But as Liam took the helm of Preston Development, digging through the wreckage his father had left behind, he began to see the absolute necessity of Audrey's actions. He saw the encrypted files Thomas Abernathy had sent over, proving that without Audrey's silent intervention, his father wouldn't just be bankrupt. He would be in federal prison, and hundreds of innocent employees would have lost their pensions. She hadn't lied to hurt him. She had lied to protect her peace, and ultimately, she had broken her own cover to save his life's work. Slowly, the trust was rebuilt. It was forged in long, difficult conversations over cheap diner coffee, late-night arguments, and eventual, profound forgiveness. 2 years later, the Riverfront Heights project stood as a shining, magnificent jewel on the Chicago skyline, a testament to modern, sustainable architecture and ethical business practices. Liam Preston stood on the penthouse balcony of the newly completed high-rise, looking out over the glittering city lights. He was the CEO of Preston Development now, operating as a highly successful, fully autonomous subsidiary of Apex Sentinel Holdings. Under his leadership, the company had instituted total financial transparency, paid every contractor above the market rate, and prioritized green building initiatives. Richard and Margaret now lived in a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom condominium in Skokie. Without the company expense accounts, their country club memberships had lapsed immediately. Richard worked a humiliating mid-level consulting job for a minor logistics firm just to pay the utility bills, while Margaret spent her days obsessively clipping grocery coupons, forever haunted by the memory of the torn $50,000 check that had sealed her doom. She wasn't wearing Tom Ford tonight. She was wearing her favorite oversized thrift store sweater, her hair pulled up into a messy bun, holding 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea. Shall send them found at an. They approved it because your data projections on urban traffic flow were completely bulletproof. Liam laughed softly, wrapping his free arm around her waist and pulling her close against him. He looked down at her, the wind catching the loose strands of her hair. His eyes were filled with a deeper, more profound adoration than he had ever felt on that rainy Tuesday in the coffee shop years ago. Have I told you lately that you are terrifyingly brilliant? Only every single day, Audrey murmured, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the sprawling empire they had salvaged from the ashes and rebuilt together. Audrey had learned that immense wealth wasn't about the heavy silver on the dining table, the size of a Tudor estate, or the hollow validation of the elite. True power was having the leverage to protect the people who genuinely mattered, and the absolute unwavering ruthlessness to dismantle those who tried to exploit them. As she looked out over the glowing grid of the city, safe in the arms of the man she loved, Audrey took a slow sip of her tea and smiled. She wouldn't change a single thing. Audrey Linwood's journey from a quiet, undercover tech millionaire to the savior of Preston development proves that true wealth cannot be measured by designer labels, inherited estates, or the elitist snobbery of high society. Margaret and Richard Preston built their identities on a fragile illusion of superiority, blinded by their own arrogance. They mistook humility for weakness and kindness for desperation. In their cruel attempt to discard someone they deemed unworthy, they unknowingly orchestrated their own absolute downfall. Audrey's ultimate revenge was not just in seizing their assets, but in violently exposing the hollow, morally bankrupt core of their existence. The story leaves us with a sharp, unforgettable lesson. Never underestimate the quietest person in the room, for power rarely needs to announce itself. True legacy isn't inherited, it is built on integrity, protected by truth, and fiercely guarded by those who know its real value.